Get up, Isabel. Everyone's watching. Vincent's voice cut through her gasped breath as she struggled to rise from the marble church floor, her 8 months pregnant belly making every movement agony. But that was still 40 minutes away. Right now, Isabel Catherine Morrison stood before St. Catherine's Cathedral in her designer maternity dress, watching her billionaire husband charm the congregation after Sunday service. The tech mogul's Thornton Foundation had just announced another $50 million donation to Catholic charities worldwide. Everyone called them the perfect Catholic power couple. Vincent Alexander Thornton moved through the crowd like a politician, his hand constantly finding the small of Isabel's back in what looked like affectionate support but felt like ownership. At 38, he had the kind of commanding presence that made people lean in when he spoke, that made investors trust him with billions, that made the Vatican Bank eager to partner with his foundation. "Mrs. Thornton, you must be so proud," gushed Mrs. Patterson from the Altar Guild. $50 million to Catholic charities. Your husband is truly blessed. Isabel smiled the way she'd been taught. We're both blessed to be able to serve the church this way. The response was Vincent's, rehearsed and approved. Her original instinct had been to mention the domestic violence shelter specifically, but Vincent had been very clear during their morning preparation. Stay general. Don't get into specifics about which causes. We don't want to seem like we're playing favorites. But the bruise on her ribs from last week's accident still ached when she breathed deeply. Vincent's grip on her elbow tightened almost imperceptibly as photographers approached. Smile wider, he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. Remember what we discussed about your speech? The speech. Isabel's stomach clenched, and not from the baby's movements. She'd written it 3 weeks ago, a heartfelt reflection on marriage, service, and the blessing of expecting their first child. Vincent had rewritten it twice. Each version removed more of her voice, more of her truth, more of anything that might suggest their marriage was anything less than divinely perfect. Cardinal Thomas Morrison approached with his characteristic warm smile. At 68, Isabel's beloved uncle carried himself with the quiet authority that had elevated him through Vatican ranks. His presence at today's announcement was both a professional courtesy and a family celebration. Uncle Thomas, Isabel said, genuine warmth breaking through her practiced composure for the first time all morning. My dear niece, the Cardinal embraced her carefully, mindful of her pregnancy. You look radiant, though perhaps a bit tired. Vincent's smile never wavered, but his hand moved to Isabel's shoulder in what looked supportive, but served as a clear reminder. Pregnancy fatigue, he said smoothly. Though Isabel insists on maintaining her full schedule of charitable commitments, I keep telling her the foundation can manage without her for a few months. Nonsense, Cardinal Morrison replied, his sharp eyes taking in more than most people realized. The church's work needs feminine wisdom, especially work involving families and children. The baby chose that moment to kick hard against Isabel's ribs, making her gasp and place her hand over her belly. Vincent was at her side instantly, the perfect concerned husband. Perhaps we should get you seated before your speech, darling, he said, though his tone carried an edge only she would recognize. As they moved toward the podium area, Isabel caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. Rebecca Fletcher, her college roommate and best friend, stood near the back of the cathedral. Rebecca's presence wasn't unusual. She attended St. Catherine's regularly, but her expression was, she was watching Vincent with the kind of careful attention that made Isabel's stomach flutter with anxiety. 3 weeks ago, Rebecca had cornered her after a charity luncheon. Izzy, that bruise on your wrist isn't from a door handle. I've seen door handle bruises. That's from fingers. Isabel had laughed it off, made excuses about pregnancy clumsiness, about Vincent being protective rather than controlling. But Rebecca's concerned expression hadn't changed. Now, as Father Daniel Sullivan adjusted the microphone and introduced her to speak about the joys of Catholic marriage and charitable giving, Isabel found herself looking directly at Rebecca. Her friend's slight nod felt like encouragement, though for what, Isabel wasn't entirely sure. My friends in Christ, Isabel began, her voice carrying clearly through the cathedral's excellent acoustics. Vincent and I are blessed to stand before you today, not just as benefactors, but as a family preparing to welcome new life. The words were Vincent's, but she found herself pausing, her hand moving instinctively to her belly, where her daughter they'd learned the sex last week pressed against her palm as if offering support. Marriage, Isabel continued, departing slightly from the script, teaches us about sacrifice, about protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Vincent's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. The deviation was small, but in their household, small deviations carried large consequences. The Foundation's work with domestic violence shelters, she said, her voice growing stronger, reminds us that some of our most important work happens behind closed doors, supporting women who need courage to speak their truth. Cherie. Domestic violence shelters hadn't been mentioned in Vincent's approved version of the speech. Cardinal Morrison nodded approvingly from his seat in the front pew. Rebecca smiled encouragement from the back, and Vincent's jaw tightened in that way that meant there would be a private discussion later. But for the first time in months, Isabel felt like herself, standing before her childhood parish, carrying new life, speaking about protecting the vulnerable. She remembered why she'd fallen in love with charitable work in the first place, before Vincent had guided her away from hands-on shelter work toward more appropriate fundraising galas, before her passionate advocacy had been replaced by carefully scripted speeches about the Foundation's generosity. Some might say, she concluded, looking directly at her uncle, that the measure of our faith isn't in how we behave in public, but in how we treat those closest to us when no one else is watching. The applause was warm and sustained. Cardinal Morrison's smile was proud, and Vincent's grip on her elbow as he helped her down from the podium was painful enough to make her breath catch. "We need to discuss your little improvisation," he said quietly, his public smile never faltering as parishioners approached to offer congratulations. Father Sullivan appeared at their side, his 25 years of ministry having given him an instinct for reading undercurrents in seemingly perfect families. "Beautiful speech, Isabel," the priest said warmly. "Very moving. The work you mentioned with domestic violence shelters, I'd love to hear more about that ministry." "I'm sure Isabel would be happy to arrange a meeting," Vincent interjected smoothly, "though her doctor has been encouraging her to reduce her commitments as the pregnancy progresses." It was a lie, delivered with such practiced ease that even Isabel almost believed it. Dr. Martinez had said no such thing. If anything, she'd encouraged Isabel to stay active and engaged. As the crowd began to thin, Vincent guided her toward the vestry with that same practiced charm, his grip on her elbow a constant reminder of how thin the line was between his public persona and private reality. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if protesting her father's proximity. Isabel gasped and stumbled slightly, but Vincent didn't reach out to steady her. Instead, his grip on her arm tightened. "Careful," he said, though his tone suggested the warning wasn't about her physical safety. Rebecca appeared beside them, her timing either coincidental or calculated. "Izzy, are you okay? You look pale." "Just tired," Isabel replied automatically, though Rebecca's concerned expression suggested she wasn't buying the explanation any more than she had 3 weeks ago. "Perhaps you should sit down," Rebecca suggested. "Vincent, shouldn't she be resting more at this stage of pregnancy?" The question hung in the air with unusual weight, and Isabel realized that her best friend was testing her husband, probing for cracks in his perfect facade. Vincent's smile remained flawless. "Of course, we were just heading home so Isabel can rest before tonight's dinner with the Cardinal." Tonight's dinner, another test, another opportunity for Vincent to control every detail of her interaction with her family. As they walked toward the cathedral doors, Isabel caught her reflection in the stained glass windows. She looked like the perfect pregnant wife of a perfect Catholic philanthropist. But reflections, she was learning, could be deceiving. And tonight's private dinner with Cardinal Morrison would be much harder to control than a public speech in a cathedral full of admirers. The foundation ceremony was just the beginning. The real test was still to come. The vestry of St. Catherine's Cathedral had witnessed countless private conversations over its century of service, but few as tense as the one unfolding now. Vincent had waited until Father Sullivan moved to the far corner, arranging vestments with the practiced efficiency of a quarter century in ministry, before his mask slipped completely. "What did I tell you about staying on message?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but carried years of controlled fury. "Do you enjoy embarrassing me, making me look like I can't control my own wife?" Isabel's hand moved protectively over her belly, where their daughter seemed to sense the tension, pressing against her ribs in sharp, uncomfortable jabs. Vincent, people were listening. Cardinal Morrison was, people are always listening. That's the point. Vincent stepped closer, his expensive cologne unable to mask the anger radiating from him. Your job is to make me look good, not to go off script about domestic violence shelters. Do you have any idea how that reflects on me? It reflects that we care about vulnerable women. It reflects that my wife thinks I'm the kind of man who beats women. Vincent's hand moved to her wrist, fingers finding the exact spot where last week's bruise was finally fading. Is that what you want people to think about me, Isabel? The pressure was light but precise, a reminder rather than a threat. Vincent had perfected the art of causing pain without leaving obvious marks, especially since her pregnancy had made bruises more difficult to explain away. You're carrying my air, he continued, his voice dropping to that dangerous register she'd learned to fear. Start acting like it matters to you. Father Sullivan's voice carried from across the vestry as he spoke quietly to a young acolyte about proper care of the ceremonial chalices. The priest's presence was both a comfort and a source of anxiety witness to Vincent's public perfection, but too distant to hear the private reality. Vincent, please, Isabel whispered. The baby. The baby is exactly why you need to remember your priorities. His fingers pressed slightly harder against the fading bruise. Our child will grow up watching how you treat me. Do you want her to think her mother doesn't respect her father? The baby kicked hard, as if protesting Vincent's proximity. Isabel's sharp intake of breath made Vincent release her wrist, but his expression remained cold. Your uncle's presence doesn't change the rules, Isabel. It just means you need to be more careful about following them. What Vincent didn't know was that Father Sullivan had exceptional hearing, honed by decades of listening to whispered confessions. The priest's movements had grown more deliberate, his attention seemingly focused on his tasks while his ears remained tuned to the conversation near the altar. Cardinal Morrison's voice carried from the cathedral as he spoke with parishioners, his warm laughter a stark contrast to the tension in the vestry. Isabel found herself longing to join him, to bask in the unconditional love she'd known from her uncle since childhood. Tonight's dinner, Vincent continued, his tone returning to something approximating normalcy as footsteps approached. Remember what we discussed? Your uncle doesn't need to hear about your concerns. He's here to celebrate the Foundation's work, not to play family therapist. Rebecca Fletcher appeared in the doorway, her timing either fortunate or calculated. I hope I'm not interrupting. Isabel, I wanted to check on you before you left. You seemed uncomfortable during the service. Vincent's smile snapped into place with practiced ease. Rebecca, how thoughtful. Isabel's just feeling the usual pregnancy fatigue. We were discussing whether she should rest before tonight's dinner. With Cardinal Morrison, Rebecca's eyebrows rose. How exciting. Isabel, you must be looking forward to spending time with your uncle. The comment was innocuous enough, but Isabel caught the underlying message. Rebecca remembered their college days, when Isabel spoke constantly about her beloved uncle, when his letters from various Vatican assignments were treasured communications that she'd read aloud to her roommate. Of course, Isabel replied carefully, though Vincent's right that I should rest first. Actually, Father Sullivan interjected, approaching with a folded vestment in his hands. Cardinal Morrison mentioned he was hoping to spend some time with you before the dinner. He's concerned that you two haven't had much opportunity to speak privately lately. Vincent's expression flickered for just a moment, surprise, calculation, perhaps irritation. That's very kind of him. Of course, Isabel's been quite busy with foundation work. We haven't wanted to impose on his time. Family is never an imposition, Father Sullivan replied mildly, but his eyes held a sharpness that suggested the priest had heard more than Vincent realized. Cardinal Morrison specifically mentioned that he'd noticed Isabel seemed subdued during the service. He wondered if everything was well. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken tensions. Rebecca shifted slightly, positioning herself where she could see both Isabel and Vincent clearly. Father Sullivan continued folding the vestment with deliberate care, waiting for someone to fill the quiet. Everything's perfect, Vincent said finally, his voice carrying just the right note of loving concern. Perhaps a bit overwhelming with the pregnancy and the Foundation's expansion, but we're blessed to have such wonderful support from the Church. Indeed, Father Sullivan agreed, though his tone suggested he was reserving judgment. Isabel, your uncle did mention he'd appreciate a few minutes alone with you, perhaps while Vincent speaks with the foundation board members who've stayed after the service. It was smoothly done, offering Vincent an excuse to be elsewhere while creating an opportunity for private conversation between uncle and niece. Vincent's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I'm sure the board members can wait, Vincent said. Isabel needs to rest before tonight. Actually, Rebecca interjected, I could drive Isabel to see her uncle. Give her a chance to relax while you handle business matters. I know how much Cardinal Morrison means to her. The offer hung in the air like a challenge. Vincent looked between Rebecca's determined expression and Father Sullivan's watchful gaze, clearly calculating the social cost of refusing such reasonable suggestions. That's very thoughtful, he said finally, but Isabel prefers to rest at home before evening commitments. Don't you? Darling! The question was posed as a loving consultation, but Isabel heard the warning beneath it. Say yes. Choose safety over truth. Choose isolation over connection. But the baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly sharp kick, as if reminding her mother that there were now two lives at stake. Isabel looked at Rebecca's encouraging face, at Father Sullivan's careful attention, at the cathedral beyond where Cardinal Morrison's voice could still be heard speaking with parishioners who loved and respected him. For the first time in months, she chose something other than Vincent's preferred answer. Actually, she said quietly, I think I would like to see Uncle Thomas. If Rebecca doesn't mind driving. Vincent's smile never wavered, but his eyes went cold. Of course, if that's what you prefer, I'll see you at home in time to prepare for dinner. The words sounded supportive, even generous, but Isabel knew she just crossed a line that would have consequences. Vincent didn't forgive challenges to his authority, however small. Tonight's private dinner with Cardinal Morrison would be more fraught than anyone realized. As they prepared to leave, Father Sullivan approached Isabel with what appeared to be casual pastoral concern. Please give my regards to your uncle, he said, his voice carrying a weight that suggested the message was more than social courtesy. And Isabel, if you ever need someone to talk to about anything, please remember that the church's doors are always open. Vincent's hand found her elbow again, his grip a reminder of boundaries and expectations. But for the first time in months, Isabel felt like she had choices beyond the ones her husband had predetermined. The afternoon conversation with Cardinal Morrison would prove to be the first crack in Vincent's carefully constructed wall of control. And tonight's dinner would test whether that crack might widen into something that could finally let the light in. The Thornton mansion gleamed under crystal chandeliers as Cardinal Morrison blessed their dining room table. Isabel had spent hours preparing, knowing Vincent would critique every detail from the flower arrangements to her conversation topics. The afternoon visit with her uncle had been refreshing, but brief Cardinal Morrison had listened more than he spoke, asking gentle questions about her health, her happiness, her hopes for motherhood. Now, watching Vincent play the perfect host, Isabel wondered if she'd imagined the concern in her uncle's eyes earlier. The house is magnificent. Vincent, Cardinal Morrison said, admiring the religious art Vincent had acquired specifically for tonight's dinner. His gaze lingered on a particular painting above the sideboard. Though I notice you have St. Catherine of Siena prominently displayed, the patron saint of preventing miscarriages. Interesting choice. Isabel's fork paused halfway to her mouth. In 3 years of marriage, she'd never paid attention to that particular painting's significance. Vincent's art acquisitions were usually about investment value and social impression, not spiritual meaning. Vincent thought it was appropriate, she said carefully. Given my condition? Indeed. Cardinal Morrison's knowing look made her uncomfortable. At 68, Thomas Morrison hadn't risen to Vatican prominence by missing subtle details or failing to read between lines. How are you feeling, my dear truly? The question hung in the air with unusual weight. Vincent's smile remained perfect as he refilled wine glasses sparkling cider for Isabel, but she caught the slight tension in his shoulders. I'm blessed, Uncle Thomas. Vincent takes such good care of me. The words came automatically, rehearsed through months of practice. But Cardinal Morrison's expression suggested he was listening for what she wasn't saying rather than what she was. Does he? The Cardinal's tone was gentle but pointed. Margaret mentioned she hasn't heard from you since Christmas. That's quite unlike the niece who used to call weekly to share every detail of her life. Vincent's hand found Isabel's under the table. His grip a clear warning disguised as affectionate contact. "Pregnancy has been quite consuming," he said smoothly. "The foundation work, preparing for the baby, managing her health, we've been trying to minimize stressful commitments." "Stressful?" Cardinal Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "I've never known family conversations to stress Isabel. She used to say talking with Margaret and me was one of her greatest joys." The baby kicked sharply, as if responding to the tension at the table. Isabel gasped and placed her free hand over her belly, using the movement to extract her other hand from Vincent's increasingly tight grip. "She's quite active tonight," Isabel said, genuine warmth entering her voice as she spoke about her daughter. "Dr. Martinez says strong movement is a good sign." "Dr. Martinez," Cardinal Morrison asked, "I thought you were seeing Dr. Kellner. He delivered you, after all." Vincent's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Dr. Kellner was the Morrison family physician, a man who'd known Isabel since birth and who might ask uncomfortable questions about her emotional state or any injuries he couldn't easily explain. Dr. Martinez was Vincent's choice, competent but unfamiliar with family history. "We wanted someone who specialized in high-risk pregnancies," Vincent said. "Given Isabel's age and stress levels." High-risk Cardinal Morrison's concern was immediate and genuine. "Isabel, you didn't mention any complications this afternoon." That's when Isabel's phone buzzed with a text message. Rebecca's name appeared on the screen. "Emergency at shelter. Woman beaten by husband needs immediate sanctuary. Remember what we talked about." The timing couldn't have been worse. Vincent read the message over her shoulder, his fingers tightening painfully around the water glass he'd been holding. "Rebecca always did have a flair for drama," Vincent said smoothly, though his knuckles were white against the crystal. "These shelter cases become quite consuming. I've been encouraging Isabel to step back from that particular charity work. Too stressful during pregnancy?" Cardinal Morrison's expression grew thoughtful. "Curious. The Vatican just approved additional funding for domestic violence programs. We believe supporting vulnerable women is some of the most important work the Church can do. In fact, I was hoping to discuss expanding the Foundation's involvement in that area." Vincent's smile never wavered, but Isabel felt his leg tense against hers under the table. The domestic violence work had been her passion before marriage, her area of expertise within the charitable sector. Vincent had systematically moved her away from hands-on involvement, claiming it was too emotionally taxing for someone in her position. "Perhaps after the baby comes," Vincent said. "Right now, our focus needs to be on Isabel's health and preparing for parenthood." "Of course," Cardinal Morrison agreed, but his attention remained fixed on his niece. "Though I imagine you miss the work. Isabel, you were so passionate about advocacy, so gifted at connecting with women in crisis." The compliment hit unexpectedly hard. When had Vincent last acknowledged her skills, her passion, her value beyond being his wife and the mother of his child? "I do miss it," Isabel said quietly, ignoring Vincent's sharp look. "Sometimes I feel like I've lost touch with the person I used to be." The admission slipped out before she could stop it, more honest than anything she'd said in months. Vincent's hand returned to her thigh under the table, his grip a clear warning. "Pregnancy changes us all," he said with practiced understanding. "I'm sure you'll find your way back to meaningful work once our daughter is born." "Our daughter will be blessed to have such a compassionate mother," Cardinal Morrison said, his eyes holding Isabel's with something that looked like encouragement. "Though I hope she won't have to wait for her mother to remember her own worth." The comment was subtle enough to avoid direct confrontation, but pointed enough to land with precision. Vincent's grip on Isabel's leg tightened to the point of pain. "Excuse me," Isabel said, pushing back from the table. "I need to use the restroom." As she walked carefully toward the powder room, she could hear Vincent smoothly redirecting the conversation toward Foundation business, his voice carrying that note of strained patience he used when dealing with people who weren't following his script. In the privacy of the powder room, Isabel stared at her reflection. Her face was fuller from pregnancy, her hair perfectly styled as Vincent preferred, her dress expensive and appropriate. She looked like the wife of a successful man, the niece of an influential cardinal, the mother-to-be of a privileged child, but she couldn't remember the last time she looked like herself. Rebecca's text message burned in her memory. A woman beaten by her husband, seeking sanctuary. Once upon a time, Isabel would have been the first person called in such situations. Her apartment had served as an informal safe house during college. Her advocacy had helped pass state legislation, strengthening protective orders. Now she planned charity galas and attended foundation meetings where others made decisions about how to help people like the woman in Rebecca's text. When she returned to the dining room, Vincent and Cardinal Morrison were deep in conversation about Vatican banking procedures. Her uncle's expertise in financial oversight had made him invaluable in cleaning up various church scandals over the years. "Ah, Isabel," Cardinal Morrison smiled as she rejoined them. "Vincent was just telling me about the Foundation's expansion plans. Very impressive scope." "Yes," Isabel agreed, settling carefully back into her chair. "Vincent has built something remarkable." "We've built something remarkable," Vincent corrected gently, his hand finding hers in what looked like affectionate correction but felt like possession. "I couldn't have done any of this without Isabel's insights and connections." It was a gracious thing to say, the kind of sentiment that would make Cardinal Morrison proud of his niece's marriage. But Isabel couldn't remember the last time Vincent had actually asked for her insights about anything more significant than menu planning. "Tell me about the domestic violence initiative," Cardinal Morrison said, his attention focused on Vincent, but his words clearly intended for both of them. "I'm particularly interested in how you're addressing the unique challenges faced by women in prominent families." The question was carefully crafted, and Isabel suspected her uncle knew exactly what he was doing. Vincent's expertise lay in technology and business, not social services. Any detailed discussion of domestic violence programs would require her input. "That's really more Isabel's area of expertise," Vincent said, his tone suggesting proud deference while his hand squeezed hers in warning. "Though we've been careful to ensure she's not too emotionally involved in individual cases during pregnancy." Cardinal Morrison turned to his niece with expectation. "I'd love to hear your thoughts, dear. The Vatican's new initiatives could benefit from someone with your background." For a moment, Isabel felt the familiar excitement of discussing work she cared about. Then Vincent's grip reminded her of boundaries and expectations. "I think," she said carefully, "that wealthy women facing abuse have unique challenges. Their abusers often hide behind philanthropic work or community standing. People find it hard to believe that men who donate to charity could be violent at home." Vincent's smile never wavered, but his hand went completely still against hers. "Society assumes that financial security equals safety," Isabel continued, her voice growing stronger. "But money can be a tool of control. Isolation can happen in mansions as easily as in trailer parks." Cardinal Morrison nodded encouragingly. "How would you address those challenges?" The question hung between them like a bridge to somewhere Isabel wasn't sure she was brave enough to cross. Vincent's hand remained motionless against hers, but she could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a furnace. And somewhere in the back of her mind, Rebecca's text message echoed, "Remember what we talked about." What they'd talked about was the difference between charity and justice, between helping others and helping herself, between building foundations to serve the vulnerable and recognizing when you'd become vulnerable yourself. "I think," Isabel said slowly, her free hand moving to rest on her belly where their daughter pressed against her palm, "that the Church's greatest strength is its ability to offer sanctuary to those who need it most." The word sanctuary seemed to hang in the air with particular weight. Cardinal Morrison's expression grew thoughtful, and Vincent's hand finally tightened against hers in unmistakable warning. But for the first time in months, Isabel felt like she was remembering who she used to be, and that person had never been afraid to speak truth to power, even when power was sitting right beside her at the dinner table. The Cardinal's limousine disappeared into the Chicago night, its taillights fading like dying embers as Vincent closed their front door with deliberate care. The evening had ended with warm embraces, promises of more frequent visits, and Cardinal Morrison's invitation for Isabel to accompany him to a Vatican conference on family advocacy in the spring. "After the baby comes, of course," he'd said with a meaningful look that suggested the invitation was about more than professional development. Now, alone in their marble foyer, Vincent's controlled facade finally cracked. "Rebecca Fletcher is poison," he snarled, pacing the black and white checkered floor like a caged predator. "I've told you before about her influence. Now she's texting during dinner with your uncle. She needed help with a shelter case. I don't care if she needed help with the second coming. Vincent stopped pacing and faced her directly, his perfect dinner attire now somehow menacing rather than elegant. You embarrassed me. Again. Isabel's 8-month pregnancy made her movements slow and deliberate, but Vincent's anger made him careless. His usual calculated control was slipping, replaced by something raw and dangerous. The domestic violence speech at church, the meaningful looks with your uncle during dinner, the little performance about sanctuary and truth. Vincent's voice rose incrementally with each accusation. Do you think I'm stupid? Isabel, do you think I don't see what you're doing? I was just answering his questions. You were sending messages. To him. To that priest. To your interfering friend. Vincent moved closer, his expensive cologne now oppressive in the enclosed space. Did you enjoy making me look like some kind of monster in front of a cardinal? The baby kicked hard against Isabel's ribs, a sharp reminder of what was at stake. She placed both hands protectively over her belly, the gesture automatic after months of practice. Vincent, please, you're scaring me. Good. Maybe fear will help you remember your priorities. His eyes were cold, calculating. We had an agreement. Isabel, you play the perfect wife, support my work, make me look good in public. In return, you get everything this marriage provides: security, status, purpose. And this isn't what I agreed to. This is exactly what you agreed to? Vincent's control was fracturing. Years of careful manipulation replaced by naked intimidation. You were nothing when I met you, a social worker with student debt and big dreams. I gave you everything. The foundation work, the social connections. This house, respectability. Each word hit like a physical blow. Isabel had heard variations of this speech before, but never delivered with such venom. Never while she was this vulnerable. You're hurting me, she said quietly, though he hadn't yet touched her physically. I'm reminding you of reality. Your uncle's influence, your friend's concern, your little advocacy speeches, none of it changes what you owe me. Vincent stepped closer, crowding her against the marble pillar that supported their grand staircase. You're carrying my heir, Isabel, not yours, mine. The possessiveness in his voice made her stomach clench with something beyond morning sickness. For the first time, she wondered if Vincent saw their daughter as another asset to control, another tool to ensure her compliance. She's our daughter. She's my daughter. Just like you're my wife. Just like this foundation is my foundation. Built with my money and my vision. Vincent's mask was completely gone now, revealing the calculating manipulator beneath years of charitable facades. The sooner you remember that, the easier this will be for everyone. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if protesting her father's proximity and tone. Isabel gasped and stumbled slightly, one hand reaching for the pillar to steady herself. Vincent didn't move to help her. Instead, he watched with cold assessment as she regained her balance. Careful, he said, though his tone suggested the warning wasn't about her physical safety. It would be unfortunate if something happened to affect your ability to fulfill your obligations. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Isabel's breath caught as the full implications hit her. Vincent wasn't just controlling her present, he was planning to control her future, using their daughter as leverage. What obligations? She whispered. The ones you agreed to when you married me. Obedience, support, maintaining appearances. Vincent's smile returned, cold and calculating. The ones that don't change just because you're carrying my child. If anything, they become more important. That's when something inside Isabel finally broke. Not her spirit that had been bending under pressure for months. Not her hope that had been gradually strangled by isolation and control. What broke was her willingness to pretend this was normal, that she deserved this treatment, that love looked anything like what Vincent was offering. What if our child grows up thinking their father is an abuser? She heard herself saying, the words emerging from some deep well of courage she'd forgotten existed. Because that's what you are, Vincent. You're abusing me. The silence that followed was deafening. Vincent's face went through a series of emotions: shock, rage, calculation before settling into something cold and dangerous. Take that back, he said quietly, his voice carrying more menace than when he'd been shouting. Take it back right now. But Isabel had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. For the first time in 3 years of marriage, she'd named what was happening to her. The truth hung between them like a sword, sharp and undeniable. "I won't," she whispered, her hands moving protectively over her belly, where their daughter seemed to press against her palms in support. "Because it's true." Vincent's control snapped completely. His hand shot out to grip her upper arm, fingers digging into the soft flesh with enough force to leave marks. "Don't you ever," he hissed, his face inches from hers, "ever accuse me of abuse. I've given you everything. Everything. A beautiful home, financial security, social status, meaningful work. Do you know what real abuse looks like?" His grip tightened, and Isabel could feel her circulation being cut off. But something had shifted inside her. Some fundamental recognition that she was already living with real abuse, that it didn't matter how beautiful the house was or how meaningful the work appeared to be. "Yes," she said clearly, looking directly into his eyes. "It looks like this." For a moment, Vincent seemed stunned by her directness. Then his face transformed into something she'd never seen before, naked fury without calculation, without the careful control that had hidden his true nature for years. "You ungrateful," he started, his grip shifting to her shoulders, shaking her with enough force to make her teeth clatter. But the baby chose that moment to kick with unusual violence, as if protesting her father's treatment of her mother. Isabel cried out, not in pain but in surprise, and Vincent immediately released her, his anger temporarily overridden by concern for his heir. "The baby!" Isabel gasped, her hands covering her belly where their daughter continued to move restlessly. "She's okay. She's just upset." Upset? Vincent's expression was unreadable. "Babies can sense stress hormones," Isabel said, drawing on knowledge from her pregnancy books. "When I'm scared or upset, she feels it too." The information seemed to penetrate Vincent's rage, introducing a calculation she recognized from his business dealings. His heir's well-being was more important than his immediate need to punish his wife's defiance. "This conversation isn't over," he said finally, his voice returning to something like control. "But you're right about one thing our daughter doesn't need to be exposed to: conflict." The euphemism was typical Vincent, avoiding the harsh realities of his behavior by wrapping them in acceptable language. But Isabel heard the implicit threat their daughter's well-being would become another tool of control, another way to ensure her compliance. "Get some rest," Vincent continued, his tone now carrying the false concern he used in public. "Tomorrow is Sunday service, and your uncle will be offering the morning mass. I trust you'll remember how to behave appropriately." As he walked toward his study, leaving her standing alone in the foyer, Isabel realized that naming the abuse had changed everything and nothing. She'd spoken the truth, but truth without power was just words hanging in expensive air. Tomorrow's service at St. Catherine's would test whether those words could become something more. Cardinal Morrison would be at the altar, Rebecca would be in the congregation, and Father Sullivan would be watching with those sharp eyes that seemed to see more than people realized. Vincent's carefully constructed world of charitable giving and public piety was about to collide with the immovable force of a woman who had finally found her voice. The question was whether that voice would be strong enough to protect both her and the daughter who seemed to be fighting alongside her from within the womb. Sunday morning would provide the answer. St. Catherine's Cathedral filled early for Cardinal Morrison's special mass. The morning light filtered through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across marble floors as parishioners settled into familiar pews. Isabel sat in their usual front row position, her perfect posture compromised by exhaustion and the barely concealed tension radiating from Vincent beside her. Sleep had been elusive after their confrontation. Vincent had spent the night in his study, emerging only to present his usual public face over breakfast, the concerned husband adjusting his pregnant wife's coat, helping her navigate the cathedral steps, his hand constantly at her elbow in what appeared to be loving support. But Isabel could feel the controlled rage beneath his solicitous attention. Every gesture carried an undercurrent of warning. Every smile held a threat. Rebecca had arrived early, positioning herself 3 pews back where she could maintain visual contact with Isabel throughout the service. Father Sullivan moved through his pre-mass preparations with the focused attention of a man who knew something significant was unfolding in his parish. Cardinal Morrison emerged from the sacristy in full ceremonial vestments, his presence commanding immediate attention. At 68, he carried himself with the quiet authority that had elevated him through Vatican ranks. But Isabel caught something different in his demeanor this morning, a watchfulness that suggested their dinner conversation had left lasting impressions. The opening hymn rose through the cathedral as the congregation stood. Vincent's arm moved to support Isabel's elbow, but his grip carried enough pressure to remind her of boundaries and expectations. "Steady," he murmured under his breath, his words audible only to her. "Remember what we discussed?" They hadn't discussed anything. Vincent had issued ultimatums while she'd finally spoken truth, but his tone suggested any deviation from perfect behavior would carry consequences. Cardinal Morrison's voice carried clearly through the cathedral's excellent acoustics as he began the liturgy. His sermon topic, announced in the bulletin, was "Speaking Truth to Power," a choice that made Vincent's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "My brothers and sisters in Christ," Cardinal Morrison began, his eyes sweeping across the congregation before settling briefly on the front pew. "We are called to be voices for the voiceless, advocates for those who cannot advocate for themselves." Isabel felt the baby kick gently, as if responding to her great-uncle's familiar voice. The movement brought an unexpected moment of peace in the tension surrounding her. "Sometimes," the cardinal continued, "our greatest test comes not from strangers, but from those closest to us. The most dangerous persecution often happens behind closed doors. Wearing the mask of love?" Vincent's hand found Isabel's thigh under her coat, his grip a clear warning. But Cardinal Morrison's words seemed aimed directly at their pew, and Isabel found herself listening with an intensity she hadn't felt in months. The Church's history is filled with saints who chose truth over safety, who protected the vulnerable even when it cost them everything. St. Catherine of Siena, our cathedral's patron, challenged popes and princes to live up to their Christian calling. The reference to St. Catherine felt significant. Isabel remembered Vincent's painting choice, the patron saint of preventing miscarriages displayed prominently in their dining room. Had her uncle noticed more than he'd let on during dinner? "Today, I want to speak particularly to those among us who may be suffering in silence," Cardinal Morrison said, his voice dropping to an intimate register that somehow carried to every corner of the cathedral. "To those who wear perfect smiles while carrying invisible wounds. To those who believe that maintaining appearances is more important than seeking help." Vincent's grip on Isabel's leg tightened to the point of pain, but she found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn by her uncle's words like a lifeline. "The Church is not a country club for the morally perfect," Cardinal Morrison continued. "It is a hospital for sinners, a sanctuary for the wounded, a refuge for those who need healing. No one is required to suffer in silence to protect someone else's reputation." The sermon continued, but those words echoed in Isabel's mind like cathedral bells. No one is required to suffer in silence. The concept felt revolutionary after months of Vincent's insistence that her problems were secondary to his public image. When the service moved to communion, Vincent guided her toward the altar with his usual possessive attention. But as they knelt at the rail, Cardinal Morrison's eyes met hers with an intensity that felt like a direct communication. "The body of Christ," he said, placing the consecrated host in her hands. "Amen," she responded automatically, but the word felt weighted with new meaning. After Mass, congregants filed slowly toward the fellowship hall for Cardinal Morrison's reception. Vincent's smile was perfectly calibrated as parishioners approached with compliments about the service and questions about foundation business. Cardinal Morrison's sermon was quite moving, Mrs. Us Patterson from the Altar Guild commented. "So relevant to current events?" "Indeed," Vincent replied smoothly. "The Cardinal has always been an eloquent speaker. Isabel's very proud to have such an influential uncle." It was the kind of response that deflected attention while maintaining social connections. But Isabel noticed how Vincent positioned himself between her and other parishioners, how his hand never left her arm, how he answered questions directed at her before she could respond. Rebecca approached with her usual warm smile, but her eyes held the sharp attention Isabel remembered from their college days when her friend was assessing potential threats. "Isabel, you look tired," Rebecca said with genuine concern. "Are you feeling all right?" "Just the usual pregnancy fatigue," Isabel replied automatically, the words emerging from months of practice. "Perhaps you should sit down," Rebecca suggested, her tone casual but her gaze fixed on Vincent's hand placement. Vincent, shouldn't she be resting more at this stage? It was the same probing approach Rebecca had used after the previous service, testing the boundaries of Vincent's control while expressing legitimate concern for her friend's welfare. Of course, Vincent agreed with practiced understanding. We were just planning to congratulate Cardinal Morrison before heading home. Father Sullivan approached their small group, his 25 years of ministry having taught him to read the undercurrents in seemingly normal conversations. Isabel, the priest said warmly, I hope you found today's sermon meaningful. Cardinal Morrison's words about sanctuary seemed particularly relevant. The word sanctuary hung in the air with the same weight it had carried at dinner. Vincent's grip on Isabel's arm tightened almost imperceptibly. Very meaningful, Isabel agreed, her voice carrying more strength than it had in weeks. Uncle Thomas has always understood the importance of protecting the vulnerable. Indeed, Father Sullivan nodded, his sharp eyes taking in Vincent's positioning, Isabel's pale complexion, the way she held herself protectively. The church's primary mission is offering refuge to those who need it most. Cardinal Morrison himself appeared at their group, his presence immediately commanding attention from other parishioners who wanted to offer congratulations on his sermon. Ah, my dear family, he said, embracing Isabel carefully while nodding respectfully to Vincent. I hope you found today's message encouraging. Very much so. Uncle Thomas? Isabel replied, genuine warmth breaking through her practiced composure for the first time that morning. I'm particularly glad to hear that, Cardinal Morrison said, his eyes holding hers with obvious meaning. Sometimes we need reminders that seeking help is not a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. Vincent's smile remained perfect, but Isabel felt his entire body tense beside her. The conversation was approaching territory he couldn't control through his usual methods. Your niece is blessed to have such a supportive family network, Vincent said smoothly, attempting to redirect the conversation towards safer ground. The foundation benefits enormously from her connections to church leadership. The foundation is fortunate indeed, Cardinal Morrison agreed, though his tone suggested he was discussing something entirely different than business partnerships. Though I sometimes wonder if Isabel feels as supported as she deserves to be. The comment was subtle enough to avoid direct confrontation, but pointed enough to land with precision. Other parishioners continued to mill around them, creating a buffer of public attention that limited Vincent's response options. That's when Vincent made his fatal mistake. In his eagerness to control the narrative, to extract Isabel from her uncle's perceptive questioning, he underestimated how many people were watching. Perhaps we should let Isabel rest, he said, his hand moving to her shoulder in what appeared to be gentle guidance, but felt like firm pressure. She's been quite tired lately. Actually, I feel fine, Isabel said, surprising herself with the response. For weeks, she'd automatically agreed with Vincent's assessments of her condition, his decisions about her needs. I'd like to stay a bit longer. Vincent's expression flickered for just a moment, surprise, calculation, irritation before settling back into practiced concern. Darling, you were just saying how much your back was aching, he said, his voice carrying loving correction while his grip on her shoulder increased pressure. Perhaps it's best if we— My back feels fine, Isabel interrupted, her voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet space around them. The interruption was minor by most standards, but in their relationship it represented a seismic shift. Vincent's control had always depended on Isabel's compliance with his version of reality. Her public contradiction threatened the careful narrative he'd constructed about their perfect marriage. Of course, if Isabel feels comfortable staying longer, Cardinal Morrison interjected smoothly, I'd be happy to ensure she gets home safely. I have the rectory car, and I'm sure Vincent has important business matters to attend to. The offer was generous and practical, but it represented everything Vincent couldn't allow Isabel spending unsupervised time with someone who asked uncomfortable questions and had the authority to act on concerning answers. That's very kind, Vincent replied, his smile strained despite his best efforts. But I prefer to take care of my wife myself, especially given her condition. His hand moved from her shoulder to her elbow, the grip firm enough to guide her movement while maintaining the appearance of supportive attention. Vincent, Isabel started. We really should go, he said, his voice carrying just enough edge that she recognized the warning beneath public civility. You'll regret overexerting yourself later. It was their old pattern playing out in public, Vincent making decisions about her needs, her capabilities, her schedule, while framing his control as loving concern. But something had shifted during Cardinal Morrison's sermon. Some recognition that she didn't have to accept this version of reality. "I'm not overexerted," she said clearly, her voice carrying farther than intended in the acoustics of the fellowship hall. "I'm fine." The word fine seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. Around them, conversations had grown quieter as other parishioners became aware of the tension between the cathedral's most prominent philanthropist and his pregnant wife. Vincent's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and dangerous before snapping back into place. "Of course you are," he said, but his tone suggested the conversation was over. "Let's just get you somewhere more comfortable." That's when he made the shove. Not hard by Vincent's private standards, just a firm push to guide his overly tired wife toward the exit, to end a conversation that was spiraling beyond his control. But Isabel was 8 months pregnant, off balance from their public confrontation, and standing on marble steps that had been polished to gleaming perfection that morning. The sound of her hitting the floor echoed through St. Catherine's Cathedral like a gunshot. The fellowship hall fell into complete silence. Isabel's gasp of pain and shock seemed to echo off the marble walls as 67 pairs of eyes turned toward the front of the room where the Thorntons had been standing moments before. Cardinal Morrison moved faster than anyone expected from a 68-year-old man, his ceremonial vestments billowing as he dropped to his knees beside his niece. Father Sullivan was immediately at her other side, his face white with horror at what he'd witnessed. "Don't move her," Rebecca's voice called out as she rushed forward from the back of the hall, her nursing background taking precedence over social niceties. "Someone call 911. Now." Vincent stood frozen above his fallen wife, his perfect mask finally shattered beyond repair. Around them, dozens of parishioners stared in stunned silence. Mrs. Patterson fumbled for her phone with shaking hands. The altar guild ladies clustered together in shocked whispers. Even the teenage acolytes who'd been clearing communion vessels stopped their work to stare. "Isabel, stay with me," Cardinal Morrison said softly, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "Can you hear me clearly? Does anything hurt?" I think I'm okay," Isabel whispered, her hands moving immediately to her belly where their daughter was moving restlessly. "The baby's okay. She's moving normally." "Thank God," Father Sullivan breathed, his eyes never leaving Vincent's face. The priest had seen domestic violence cases during his ministry, but never so blatantly displayed in his own church. Vincent, Cardinal Morrison's voice when he looked up was completely different from his gentle tone with Isabel. Cold authority had replaced pastoral warmth. "Step away from my niece." "This is a misunderstanding," Vincent began, his voice carrying the panic of a man whose carefully constructed world was crumbling in real time. "Step away. Now." Father Sullivan rose slowly, positioning himself between Vincent and the small crowd gathering around Isabel. His usually mild demeanor had been replaced by something that reminded parishioners why the church had survived 2,000 years of persecution and scandal. "Vincent, I think it's best if you wait outside for the paramedics," the priest said with absolute authority. Several of the men from the parish council moved subtly to support Father Sullivan's directive. Vincent found himself surrounded by people who donated to his foundation, praised his charitable work, and treated him with the deference due to wealth and social position. Now they looked at him like they'd never seen him before. "She fell," Vincent said loudly, his voice carrying desperation he'd never allowed in public. "She's been clumsy all pregnancy. Ask anyone. Isabel has always been—" "Careful," Rebecca interrupted sharply, her hands checking Isabel's pulse and responsiveness with professional efficiency. "Be very careful what you say right now." The arrival of Rebecca Fletcher in the scene's center seemed to catalyze something in the other witnesses. Mrs. Patterson had successfully reached emergency services and was providing details to the dispatcher. The altar guild ladies were organizing to clear space for paramedics. The parish council members were creating a protective barrier around the injured woman. Vincent was no longer the center of concerned attention. He had become something else entirely, a threat to be managed. "Tell them what happened, Isabel," Vincent said, his voice carrying both pleading and demand. "Tell them you fell. Tell them how clumsy you've been lately." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in that fellowship hall, from the youngest acolyte to the oldest parishioner, was waiting for Isabel Morrison Thornton's response. Cardinal Morrison's eyes never left Vincent's face as he spoke quietly to his niece. "Isabel, what happened here? Tell us exactly what you remember." The question hung in the sacred air between truth and consequences, between maintaining appearances and protecting life, between the woman Isabel had been forced to become and the person she'd once been. She looked up at her husband, standing above her with panic replacing his usual controlled composure, then at her uncle's compassionate face, radiating the same unconditional love she'd known since childhood, at Rebecca's encouraging nod and steady presence, at Father Sullivan's protective stance and the dozen parishioners who'd formed an unconscious circle of concern around her. 20 years of Catholic education had taught her about sanctuary and truth. 3 years of marriage had taught her about silence and survival. 8 months of pregnancy had taught her about protecting the innocent, even when it required tremendous courage. "He pushed me," she said simply, her voice carrying clearly in the acoustics that had been designed to amplify truth. "Vincent pushed me." And with those 4 words, everything Vincent Thornton had built began to crumble. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps echoed through the fellowship hall. Mrs. Patterson's voice on the phone became more urgent as she relayed the information to emergency dispatchers. Several parishioners pulled out their own phones, and Vincent realized with growing horror that this moment was being documented. "That's not she's confused from the fall," Vincent started. "Sir," Father Sullivan's voice cut through Vincent's protest with absolute authority. "You need to leave. Now. This is my wife, my pregnant wife. I'm not leaving her." "You are leaving," Cardinal Morrison said, rising slowly to his full height while keeping one protective hand near Isabel's shoulder. "Security will escort you if necessary." Vincent looked around the fellowship hall with growing desperation. These were people who'd celebrated his charitable giving, who'd praised his marriage, who'd treated him as a pillar of the Catholic community. Now they looked at him with expressions ranging from shock to disgust to active hostility. The sound of sirens grew louder outside the cathedral. Within minutes, paramedics would arrive, followed by police officers who would take statements from dozens of witnesses. The story would spread through Catholic social media networks before evening. By tomorrow, it would be national news. "Isabel." Vincent tried one final approach, his voice breaking with what might have been genuine emotion or calculated manipulation. "Please, think about what you're doing. Think about the foundation, all the good work we do together. Think about our daughter." But Isabel was already thinking about their daughter, about the woman she wanted that little girl to become, about the example she wanted to set about courage and truth and refusing to accept unacceptable treatment. "I am thinking about our daughter," Isabel said clearly, her hand moving protectively over her belly. "I'm thinking about what kind of world I want her to grow up in." The sirens stopped outside the cathedral doors. Heavy footsteps echoed in the main nave as emergency responders made their way toward the fellowship hall. Vincent had perhaps 30 seconds before his private crisis became a matter of public record. "This isn't over," he said quietly, but his words carried to everyone in the suddenly silent space. "Yes," Cardinal Morrison replied with absolute finality. "It is." As paramedics entered the fellowship hall with their equipment and urgent professionalism, as police officers began the process of taking witness statements, as the perfect facade of Catholic philanthropy cracked beyond repair, Isabel Morrison Thornton closed her eyes and felt her daughter's strong kicks against her ribs. For the first time in months, those kicks felt like celebration rather than distress. Her daughter seemed to understand, even from within the womb, that truth had finally found its voice, and that voice would not be silenced again. The emergency room at Chicago Memorial buzzed with controlled chaos. Isabel's vital signs were stable, the baby's heartbeat strong and regular, but the witnesses from St. Catherine's Cathedral had not remained silent. By early evening, news vans were gathering in the hospital parking lot as word spread through Catholic networks like wildfire. Cardinal Morrison sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside his niece's hospital bed, his ceremonial vestments replaced by simple clerical clothes, but his expression carrying the cold fury of a man who'd spent 40 years fighting corruption in various forms. "Uncle Thomas," Isabel said weakly, her voice hoarse from recounting the afternoon's events to police officers, social workers, and medical staff. "Vincent's foundation does so much good work, the charities that depend on his donations. Vincent's foundation is built on blood money if this is how he treats his family, Cardinal Morrison interrupted, his gentle tone with her contrasting sharply with the steel underneath. Tell me everything, child, from the beginning, and I mean everything. Over the next hour, Isabel finally spoke the complete truth. The controlling behavior that had started subtly during their engagement, Vincent's opinions about her clothing, her friends, her career choices presented as loving guidance, the escalating emotional manipulation after marriage isolation, disguised as protection, financial control framed as security, public humiliation masked as helpful correction, the physical incidents that Vincent always explained away, the accidental collision that left her with bruised ribs, the playful grip that left finger marks on her wrists, the increasing frequency of clumsiness as her pregnancy progressed and her mobility decreased. Rebecca provided corroboration from her position in the corner chair, sharing screenshots of worried text messages and photos of suspicious injuries that Isabel had explained away as pregnancy-related mishaps. Why didn't you tell me? Cardinal Morrison asked gently when she finished. You used to share everything with me. Because he's right about the foundation, Isabel whispered. 70% of their charitable giving goes to Catholic organizations, hospitals, schools, shelters, international relief programs. If I destroyed that by speaking up, if you destroyed what by speaking up, Cardinal Morrison's voice carried the authority that had made him one of the Vatican's most effective corruption fighters, a foundation built on the abuse of women, a charitable enterprise that requires your silence about violence. While they talked, Cardinal Morrison had been making phone calls that would reverberate through Vatican City and Catholic charitable organizations worldwide. His assistant Timothy Crawford was fielding urgent communications from Rome, and the Vatican Bank's overnight staff were preparing documentation for emergency financial reviews. Uncle Thomas, Isabel said, watching him scroll through messages on his phone. What are you doing? What I should have done the moment I suspected something was wrong, Cardinal Morrison replied grimly. Timothy, yes, I need you to prepare a statement for immediate release. The Vatican's position on the Thornton Foundation partnership, effective immediately. Rebecca leaned forward from her corner chair. Cardinal Morrison, are you sure about this? Vincent has lawyers, connections, influence. He'll fight back. Let him fight, Cardinal Morrison said coldly. The Church has survived emperors and dictators. Miss Fletcher, we can certainly handle one abusive billionaire with a charitable tax shelter. His phone rang, displaying a Vatican City country code. Cardinal Morrison answered immediately, switching into the rapid Italian that Isabel remembered from childhood visits when he'd been called away on church business. The conversation was brief but intense. When he hung up, Cardinal Morrison's expression was grim with satisfaction. That was Cardinal Turkson from the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, he told them. The Holy See is invoking immediate suspension protocols for the Thornton Foundation partnership pending investigation into serious allegations regarding the treatment of vulnerable individuals. Isabel stared at her uncle in shock. You mean? I mean Vincent Thornton's charitable empire just lost its Vatican endorsement, its Catholic institutional funding, and its ecclesiastical legitimacy, Cardinal Morrison said with the kind of cold efficiency that had made him legendary in Vatican financial circles. Effective immediately. The implications were staggering. The Thornton Foundation's entire reputation was built on Catholic partnerships. Their fundraising relied heavily on church endorsements. Major donors contributed specifically because of the Vatican connection. By morning, Cardinal Morrison continued, consulting his phone as new messages arrived, every Catholic charity, hospital, school, and relief organization worldwide will have received notification that financial relationships with Vincent Thornton or any entity he controls are suspended pending Vatican investigation. Rebecca whistled softly. That's comprehensive. Violence against pregnant women in sacred spaces carries automatic ecclesiastical penalties, Cardinal Morrison explained. But more importantly, the Church cannot be seen as complicit in systems that harm the vulnerable, regardless of how much money is involved. A soft knock on the door interrupted them. Father Sullivan entered with the hospital chaplain, both men carrying the drawn expressions of clergy who'd spent the afternoon dealing with crisis. How is she? Father Sullivan asked immediately. Physically fine, Cardinal Morrison replied. Emotionally processing, spiritually awakening, I think. Vincent's been trying to get information from the hospital, the chaplain reported. His lawyers have been calling, demanding visitation rights, claiming spousal privilege. Hospital security is following your directive to refuse access? Good. Cardinal Morrison's tone brooked no argument. Has there been any media contact? Father Sullivan nodded grimly. 3 news stations have called the rectory. Catholic News Service is preparing a story for their evening bulletin. Vincent's public relations firm issued a statement an hour ago claiming this was all a misunderstanding caused by pregnancy-related dizziness. Of course they did, Rebecca said acidly. Blame the victim. Classic abuser playbook. Not anymore, Cardinal Morrison said, his phone buzzing with another incoming call. Timothy, perfect timing. Read me the statement before we release it. He listened intently, occasionally offering corrections or additions. When he finished, Cardinal Morrison looked directly at his niece. Isabel, I want you to hear this before it goes out. This statement will be distributed to Catholic media worldwide within the hour. He switched to speakerphone and nodded to his assistant. Timothy Crawford's voice came through clearly. The Holy See announces the immediate suspension of all financial partnerships between Vatican institutions and the Thornton Foundation, pending comprehensive investigation into serious allegations regarding domestic violence and the abuse of vulnerable individuals. The Church cannot and will not maintain financial relationships with any entity that harms women, children, or families, regardless of the scale of charitable contributions involved. The statement continued with technical details about financial reviews and partnership suspensions. But the core message was devastating. The Catholic Church was publicly severing ties with Vincent Thornton based on allegations of domestic abuse. My God, Isabel whispered. Vincent's going to be furious. Vincent's going to be ruined, Cardinal Morrison corrected. His foundation will lose approximately 70% of its funding sources within a week. His corporate board will face intense pressure from Catholic institutional investors. His social standing in Catholic philanthropic circles is finished. Father Sullivan looked concerned. Cardinal, won't Vincent blame Isabel for this? Won't it make her situation more dangerous? Vincent can't hurt what he can't reach, Cardinal Morrison replied. Isabel and the baby will be under church protection until this is resolved. The rectory, the hospital, Catholic Family Services, she'll have sanctuary wherever she needs it. Error. The word sanctuary carried medieval weight in Cardinal Morrison's voice, invoking centuries of church tradition, protecting those who sought refuge from violence and persecution. Isabel's phone, which had been silent all afternoon, suddenly began buzzing with incoming calls. Vincent's name appeared on the screen repeatedly, followed by unknown numbers that were likely his lawyers and associates. Don't answer, Rebecca advised. Let them go to voicemail. Actually, Cardinal Morrison said thoughtfully, let me see that phone. He scrolled through the missed calls and messages, his expression growing colder with each screen. Threats disguised as concern, manipulation framed as love, financial intimidation presented as practical advice. He handed the phone back to Isabel. This is evidence, my dear. Document everything. As if summoned by their conversation, a hospital security officer appeared at the door. Excuse me, Cardinal Morrison. There's a Vincent Thornton in the lobby demanding to see his wife. He's caused quite a scene. Claims he has legal rights. Should we escort him off hospital property? Cardinal Morrison said without hesitation. If he returns, call the police. Yes, sir. He did say to tell you that he'll see you in court, that the Vatican doesn't have jurisdiction in Chicago, and that this won't end here. Cardinal Morrison's smile was not kind. Please tell Mr. Thornton that he's partially correct. The Vatican doesn't have civil jurisdiction in Chicago, but we do have moral authority over billions of Catholics worldwide, including the ones who donate to his foundation, invest in his companies, and attend the social events that built his reputation. The security officer nodded and left. Within minutes, they could hear raised voices from the lobby below, followed by the sound of someone being escorted away from the building. It's really happening, Isabel said softly, her hand moving over her belly where their daughter continued to move restlessly. His whole world is falling apart. His world was built on lies and violence, Cardinal Morrison replied. It was always going to fall apart eventually. The only question was whether it would fall apart before or after he destroyed you completely. Father Sullivan approached the bed with pastoral concern. Isabel, How are you feeling about all this? It's a lot to process. For the first time in hours, Isabel considered the question seriously. How did she feel about watching her husband's empire crumble in real time? About knowing that her words in the cathedral had triggered a series of events that would destroy Vincent's reputation, his business, his social standing? Free, she said finally, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Terrified, but free. The baby kicked strongly against her hand, as if agreeing with the assessment. For the first time in months, those movements felt like celebration rather than distress. Cardinal Morrison squeezed her other hand gently. Freedom is terrifying, my dear, but it's also the first requirement for happiness. Outside the hospital windows, the Chicago skyline glittered with lights that seemed somehow brighter than before. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, divorce proceedings, custody negotiations, media attention, the long process of rebuilding a life that had been systematically dismantled by someone who claimed to love her. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Isabel Morrison Thornton fell asleep without fear. The church that had raised her was finally protecting her, and her daughter was growing strong inside the sanctuary of her body. Vincent's carefully constructed world was crumbling, but something infinitely more valuable was being born. St. Catherine's Cathedral had never hosted a confrontation quite like this. The morning sun streamed through stained glass windows as Vincent Thornton arrived with an entourage that looked more like a corporate takeover than a pastoral meeting, 3 lawyers in expensive suits, a public relations consultant checking her phone constantly, and a private security officer whose presence suggested Vincent no longer trusted his reception at the parish where he'd been celebrated just days before. Cardinal Morrison came alone, flanked only by 2 Vatican security officers whose quiet competence spoke of experience handling far more dangerous situations than one angry billionaire. But the cathedral wasn't empty. Word had spread through the parish network with the efficiency of a small community faced with extraordinary circumstances. Rebecca sat in the front pew beside Margaret Morrison, who had flown in overnight from Chicago's north suburbs. The altar guild ladies occupied their usual positions, but their expressions carried none of their typical warmth toward the foundation's major benefactor. Father Sullivan positioned himself near the altar, ready to protect the sacred space if necessary. Vincent's opening strategy was as predictable as it was desperate. He strode down the center aisle with the commanding presence that had served him well in boardrooms, his voice echoing off marble walls as he launched into his prepared offensive. "Cardinal Morrison, this has gone far enough," Vincent declared, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to deference. "Your statement yesterday has caused tremendous damage to Catholic charities worldwide. The Thornton Foundation supports over 300 institutions. Your actions will hurt millions of people." Cardinal Morrison remained seated in the front pew, his stillness more commanding than Vincent's pacing. "Vincent, you pushed your pregnant wife in this cathedral, in front of dozens of witnesses, including myself. She fell." Vincent began the familiar refrain. "She fell because you pushed her. I saw it with my own eyes." Cardinal Morrison's voice carried the absolute authority of someone who had spent decades distinguishing truth from manipulation. "Father Sullivan saw it. Ms. Fletcher saw it. Mrs. Patterson saw it. Should I continue listing witnesses, or would you prefer to hear from them directly?" Vincent's lead attorney stepped forward, a sharp-featured woman whose reputation for aggressive corporate defense preceded her into the cathedral. "Cardinal Morrison," the lawyer said smoothly, "my client is prepared to make a substantial donation to Catholic charities to help resolve this unfortunate misunderstanding. Perhaps we could discuss terms that would benefit everyone involved." The silence that followed was profound. Cardinal Morrison rose slowly from his pew, his ceremonial vestments replaced by simple black clerics that somehow made him appear more formidable rather than less. "Counselor," he said with dangerous quiet, "you are standing in God's house. Do not compound your client's sins by attempting to bribe a prince of the church." "It's not a bribe," the lawyer protested. "It's a charitable contribution designed to—" "Stop." Cardinal Morrison's voice cut through her explanation like a blade. "Another word about money, and I'll have you escorted from sacred ground." Vincent's public relations consultant whispered urgently in her client's ear, probably advising him about damage control and media management. But Vincent seemed beyond strategic thinking, his carefully maintained control cracking under the pressure of losing everything he'd built. "You can't do this to me," Vincent said, his voice carrying a desperation that none of the parish witnesses had ever heard from the composed philanthropist. "I've given millions to Catholic causes. I've supported this cathedral, Catholic schools, hospitals, relief programs worldwide. You can't destroy all of that because of one moment of what?" Vincent, Cardinal Morrison's question hung in the cathedral air like an ultimatum. "What would you call pushing a pregnant woman in a sacred space?" Vincent's lawyers exchanged glances, recognizing the trap their client was about to walk into. Any answer he gave would be either an admission of guilt or an obvious lie in front of multiple witnesses. "It was an accident," Vincent said finally. "A moment of poor judgment during a stressful conversation." "Poor judgment," Cardinal Morrison repeated the phrase with the kind of emphasis that made it sound obscene. "Is that also what you call 3 years of systematically isolating and controlling your wife poor judgment?" The question revealed how much investigation had occurred in the 24 hours since the cathedral incident. Vincent's expression shifted as he realized that Isabel had shared far more than just the public assault. "My relationship with my wife is private." "Nothing is private once it enters God's house," Father Sullivan interjected from his position near the altar. "Vincent, you brought your violence into this sacred space. That makes it the church's concern." Vincent's composure finally cracked completely. "This is insane. You're destroying charitable work that helps thousands of people because of a marital disagreement." "A marital disagreement?" Rebecca's voice carried from the front pew, sharp with disbelief. "You assaulted a pregnant woman in a cathedral during a reception for a cardinal? That's not a disagreement, it's a crime." Vincent whirled to face her, his public relations consultant visibly cringing at her client's loss of control. You started this. You and your interfering messages, your constant undermining of my marriage." "I started nothing," Rebecca replied evenly. "I simply refused to pretend that bruises were accidents and isolation was protection." Cardinal Morrison stepped between Vincent and Rebecca, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Vincent, you have 30 seconds to compose yourself before I have you removed from this cathedral." Vincent's attorneys moved closer to their client, clearly recognizing that the situation was spiraling beyond any hope of damage control. The public relations consultant was typing frantically on her phone, probably alerting crisis management teams about the unfolding disaster. "This isn't over," Vincent said, his voice dropping to something like his old controlled register. "I have resources, connections, influence. The Vatican may be able to destroy my foundation, but I can rebuild. I can fight back." That's when Cardinal Morrison delivered the blow that would end Vincent's membership in the Catholic Church forever. "Vincent Alexander Thornton," he said, his voice carrying the formal authority of ecclesiastical law, "by the authority vested in me by His Holiness Pope Francis and the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, I hereby declare you excommunicated lati sententii from the Roman Catholic Church for the sin of violence against the innocent within sacred ground." The legal Latin phrase meant automatic excommunication, a penalty incurred by the act itself, rather than imposed by church authority. But Cardinal Morrison's public declaration made it official and irreversible across the worldwide Catholic Church. The silence that followed was absolute. Vincent's lawyers stared in shock. His public relations consultant had gone pale. Even the parish witnesses seemed stunned by the formal severity of the pronouncement. "Furthermore," Cardinal Morrison continued with relentless precision, "all Catholic institutions worldwide are hereby notified that Vincent Thornton and any entity he controls are declared persona non grata. No Catholic charity, hospital, school, university, or organization may accept funding from Vincent Thornton or maintain financial relationships with his businesses." The implications were staggering. Vincent's entire social and business network was built on Catholic connections, Catholic universities where he served on boards, Catholic hospitals that bore his name on wings and research centers, Catholic charities that formed the foundation of his philanthropic reputation. Vincent's face went white, then red, then white again as the full scope of his destruction became clear. Excommunication meant he couldn't receive the sacraments, couldn't be buried in Catholic ground, couldn't participate in any Catholic ceremony or institution. The persona non grata designation meant that his business empire, built largely on Catholic institutional relationships, was finished. "You can't do this," Vincent whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. I already have, Cardinal Morrison replied. And unlike your marriage vows, Vincent, this declaration is permanent and binding across all 6 continents where the Catholic Church operates. One of Vincent's attorneys finally found her voice. Cardinal Morrison, surely we can discuss. There is nothing to discuss, Cardinal Morrison said with finality. Mr. Thornton committed violence against a pregnant woman in sacred space in front of dozens of witnesses, including myself. The penalty is automatic under canon law. The only discretion involved was whether to announce it publicly. Father Sullivan stepped forward with what appeared to be pastoral concern, but carried undertones of absolute authority. Vincent, I strongly suggest you leave now. Continuing this confrontation will only make things worse. The sound of cameras clicking filled the cathedral. Several parishioners had been discreetly documenting the confrontation, and the images would be circulating on Catholic social media within minutes. By evening, the story would be international news. Billionaire philanthropist excommunicated for church assault. Vincent looked around the cathedral with growing desperation, searching for anyone who might offer support or sympathy. Instead, he found faces that ranged from shock to disgust to active hostility. These were people who had celebrated his charitable giving, who had praised his marriage, who had treated him as a pillar of the Catholic community. Now they looked at him like a stranger. Worse than a stranger, like a threat to everything they held sacred. Isabel will come back to me, Vincent said suddenly, grasping at his last perceived source of leverage. She's carrying my child. She'll realize she needs me. Cardinal Morrison's expression grew even colder. Isabel is under church protection. Vincent, you will have no contact with her or the child except through legal channels, supervised by court-appointed advocates. She's my wife. She's a victim of domestic violence who has sought sanctuary, Cardinal Morrison corrected. The church has been providing sanctuary to the vulnerable for 2,000 years. We're not going to stop for you. Vincent's public relations consultant finally found her voice, probably recognizing that damage control was impossible, but hoping to limit the scope of disaster. Mr. Thornton, we need to leave. Now. But Vincent seemed incapable of accepting the finality of his situation. 3 years of controlling Isabel through intimidation and manipulation had not prepared him for confronting an institution that wielded moral authority over 1 billion people worldwide. I built that foundation, he said desperately. I created those charitable programs. I helped thousands of people. You built nothing, Rebecca said from her pew, her voice carrying clearly in the cathedral acoustics. You wrote checks. Other people, including Isabel, did the actual work of helping people, and now they'll continue that work without blood money. The phrase blood money seemed to strike Vincent like a physical blow. He stared at Rebecca, then at Cardinal Morrison, then at Father Sullivan, as if hoping someone would contradict the assessment. Instead, Father Sullivan nodded agreement. The church's charitable work will continue. Vincent, it existed before your foundation and will exist long after. What won't continue is pretending that money can purchase absolution for violence. Vincent's last attempt at control was exactly what everyone expected, a desperate offer to surrender everything in exchange for what he'd lost through his own actions. I'll give it all away, he said, his voice breaking with what might have been genuine desperation or calculated manipulation. Every penny of my fortune, the house, the companies, the art collection, everything. Just let me have my wife and daughter back. Cardinal Morrison's response was swift and final. Vincent, the Catholic Church does not negotiate with terrorists, and men who assault pregnant women in sacred spaces are terrorists of the soul. The words echoed off the cathedral walls with devastating finality. Vincent's attorneys were already moving toward the doors, recognizing that their client's situation was beyond legal remedy. His public relations consultant had given up on damage control and was probably calculating how quickly she could distance her firm from the disaster. As church security officers moved to escort Vincent away, he made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his carefully constructed life. This isn't justice, he called out, his voice echoing in the vast space. This is revenge. Cardinal Morrison's final words followed him down the center aisle. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Vincent, today, justice finally arrived. The heavy cathedral doors closed behind Vincent Thornton with the sound of finality. He would never again enter St. Catherine's Cathedral as anything other than a cautionary tale about the difference between charity and righteousness, between public virtue and private character. In the silence that followed, the witnesses began to understand that they had just observed something unprecedented, the complete destruction of a man who had believed that wealth could purchase immunity from consequences, that charitable giving could balance the scales against domestic violence, that public virtue could mask private sin. The Catholic Church had just demonstrated that some sins could not be absolved with money, some wounds could not be healed with donations, and some crimes carried consequences that no amount of influence could overcome. Vincent Thornton's empire was finished, but Isabel Morrison's real life was finally about to begin. 3 weeks after the cathedral confrontation, Isabel Catherine Morrison, she had legally reclaimed her maiden name, sat in her uncle's study at the Chicago rectory, signing divorce papers while her newborn daughter slept peacefully in a bassinet nearby. Catherine Rose Morrison had arrived 2 weeks early, as if eager to enter a world where truth had finally triumphed over manipulation. The tabloid headlines had been brutal but accurate. Billionaire excommunicated for church assault dominated Catholic media worldwide. Vatican cuts all ties with abusive philanthropist had made international news. Vincent's business empire was imploding with the systematic precision that Cardinal Morrison had predicted. The Thornton Foundation's board had voted Vincent out within 48 hours of his excommunication, installing an interim leadership team that immediately began the process of restructuring operations without their disgraced founder. Stock prices for Vincent's tech companies had plummeted as Catholic institutional investors, pension funds, university endowments, hospital systems divested their holdings according to Vatican directive. 3 major universities had returned donated funds and removed Vincent's name from buildings. The Thornton Wing at Chicago Catholic Hospital was being renamed. The Thornton Foundation's annual charity gala had been canceled indefinitely. "How do you feel about all this?" Dr. Elena Vasquez asked during their weekly counseling session in the rectory's comfortable parlor. Isabel considered the question while watching her daughter's tiny fist curl around her finger. 2 months ago, she would have felt guilty about the destruction of Vincent's charitable empire. She would have worried about the people affected by lost funding, the institutions scrambling to replace Thornton Foundation support, the social chaos caused by her decision to finally speak truth. "Free," she said, echoing the words she'd used in the hospital. "And proud of her." She looked down at Catherine, who had entered the world with the kind of strong lungs that suggested she would never have trouble making her voice heard. The baby bore no resemblance to Vincent. She was pure Morrison, with dark hair and the distinctive chin that marked Cardinal Morrison's family line. Vincent demanded paternity tests, Rebecca said from her chair by the window where she'd been answering emails for Catherine's house, the domestic violence shelter they'd established with funding from progressive Catholic donors who supported the Vatican's stance against the Thornton Foundation. "His lawyers are still trying to establish visitation rights." "Let them try," Isabel said with a calm that would have been impossible a month ago. "Dr. Martinez documented every injury I tried to hide during pregnancy. The hospital has photographs of the bruises from his final assault. His own lawyers advised him to plead no contest to the criminal charges." The legal proceedings had moved with surprising speed once Vincent's reputation crumbled. Without the shield of philanthropic respectability, his behavior appeared exactly as it was: systematic abuse of a pregnant woman by someone with vastly superior resources and social power. Margaret Morrison entered the study carrying a tea tray and the satisfied expression of a woman whose protective instincts had finally found appropriate outlet. "The reporters are gone from the front gate," she announced, though Timothy called from the Vatican to say there's still international interest in the story. The media attention had been intense but largely sympathetic. Vincent's excommunication was unprecedented enough to generate worldwide Catholic news coverage. But the underlying story, powerful man abuses pregnant wife, was unfortunately familiar enough that most coverage focused on the Church's decisive response rather than questioning Isabel's credibility. "Have you decided about the Vatican conference invitation?" Dr. Vasquez asked. Cardinal Morrison had extended a formal invitation for Isabel to address the Holy See's Spring Conference on Family Advocacy and Domestic Violence Prevention. The opportunity to speak before Vatican officials about the intersection of wealth, power, and abuse would give her platform to influence policy at the highest levels of church authority. "I want to do it," Isabel said. her voice carrying new strength. Catherine will be old enough to travel by then, and I think the church needs to hear from someone who's lived through what they're trying to address. Catherine chose that moment to wake with the imperious cry of someone accustomed to having her needs met immediately. As Isabel lifted her daughter for feeding, she marveled at how natural motherhood felt compared to the artificial performance that marriage to Vincent had required. "Any word from Vincent lately?" Rebecca asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "His lawyers send formal communication about financial settlements," Isabel replied, settling into the comfortable nursing chair Margaret had installed near the window. "But Vincent himself hasn't tried direct contact since the restraining order was finalized." The restraining order had been surprisingly easy to obtain once Cook County Family Court reviewed the evidence. Hospital records, witness statements, photographs of injuries, and video footage of the cathedral assault had created an overwhelming case for protection from further contact. More importantly, Vincent's excommunication and the Vatican's persona non grata designation had effectively ended his social standing in the Chicago Catholic community, where both families had deep roots. Isabel was surrounded by support systems that had existed long before Vincent's money entered the picture. "He's at the Catholic Worker House on the South Side," Cardinal Morrison said, entering the study with the day's correspondence. "Court-ordered community service, 300 hours serving meals to homeless families." The irony was too perfect to ignore. Vincent, who had written checks to homeless shelters as tax-deductible charitable contributions, was now ladling soup for people whose problems couldn't be solved with foundation grants and philanthropic galas. "How's he handling it?" Margaret asked with the kind of Christian charity that suggested she didn't particularly care about the answer. "According to Father Rodriguez, he's learning that actual service requires humility rather than just money," Cardinal Morrison replied. "Yesterday, a pregnant teenager came to the shelter with bruises that looked remarkably familiar. Vincent apparently spent an hour helping her contact Catherine's house for emergency placement." The story carried layers of meaning that weren't lost on anyone in the room. Vincent's court-ordered service was bringing him face-to-face with the reality of domestic violence in ways that his foundation's charitable giving never had. "Do you think he's actually changing?" Dr. Vasquez asked with professional curiosity. Isabel considered the question while Catherine nursed contentedly, her tiny hand opening and closing against her mother's chest. "I think Vincent is learning what consequences feel like," she said finally. "Whether that leads to actual change, that's not my concern anymore." The liberation in that statement was profound. For 3 years, Vincent's emotional state, his reactions, his approval or disapproval had been central to Isabel's daily existence. Now his psychological journey toward whatever passed for redemption was simply irrelevant to her life. "The foundation restructuring is almost complete," Cardinal Morrison reported, consulting his correspondence. "The new board has voted to rename it the Morrison Family Foundation for Vulnerable Women and Children. They've asked if you'd consider serving as chairwoman once Catherine is older." The offer was both honoring and overwhelming. Isabel's expertise in domestic violence advocacy, combined with her personal experience and her family's ecclesiastical connections, would make her uniquely qualified to lead Catholic charitable work in that area. "I'd want to maintain hands-on involvement," Isabel said. "Not just fundraising and board meetings. Real work with real people." "Of course," Cardinal Morrison smiled. "I believe the exact phrase the new board used was authentic leadership from someone who understands the issues personally." Rebecca looked up from her laptop where she'd been managing Catherine's house communications. "Speaking of which, we've had 17 new applications for emergency placement this week. Word is spreading that we actually understand what women in abusive situations need." Catherine's house had become something unprecedented in Catholic social services, a shelter specifically designed for pregnant women and new mothers escaping domestic violence. The facility combined immediate safety with long-term support, legal advocacy, job training, childcare, counseling, and transitional housing that could accommodate mothers with infants. "The Archbishop of Los Angeles called this morning," Cardinal Morrison continued. "They want to establish a similar program there. Apparently our model is generating interest internationally." From the ruins of Vincent's foundation had grown something infinitely more valuable, a network of Catholic institutions specifically focused on protecting pregnant women and young mothers from domestic violence. The work was funded by the same Catholic donors who had supported the Thornton Foundation. But now their money supported programs designed by someone who understood the problems from personal experience. "I keep thinking about that woman Rebecca texted me about during Uncle Thomas's dinner," Isabel said, adjusting Catherine against her shoulder for burping. "The one who needed emergency sanctuary the night everything started to fall apart." "Maria Santos," Rebecca supplied immediately. "She and her baby are in our transitional housing program now. She starts nursing school in the fall." "That's what this is all about," Isabel said, watching her daughter's sleepy contentment. "Making sure other women don't have to choose between safety and survival." Dr. Vasquez made a note in her session records. "You've come remarkably far in a very short time." The woman who was afraid to contradict her husband's version of reality is now designing programs to help other women in similar situations. "That woman was trapped in Vincent's story about who she was supposed to be," Isabel replied. "This is who I actually am." Cardinal Morrison smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose protective instincts had finally found appropriate expression. "I always knew this was who you were, my dear." Vincent's mistake was thinking that money and manipulation could change fundamental character. Outside the rectory windows, Chicago's skyline glittered with lights that somehow seemed brighter than they had during her marriage. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, speaking engagements about domestic violence, board meetings for Catherine's house, the ongoing legal proceedings that would formally end her marriage to Vincent. But tonight, surrounded by family and friends who had protected her when she couldn't protect herself, holding a daughter who would grow up knowing that her voice mattered from the very beginning, Isabel Morrison felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Vincent's empire had crumbled, but something infinitely more valuable had been built in its place, proof that truth, once spoken, could not be silenced, and that institutions dedicated to protecting the vulnerable would always be stronger than individuals committed to exploiting them. The perfect Catholic couple was dead, but the real Isabel Morrison had finally been reborn. 6 months after Catherine Rose Morrison's birth, the baby gurgled happily in her mother's arms during Sunday Mass at St. Catherine's Cathedral. The congregation had embraced their roles as protective extended family, and Catherine had dozens of honorary grandparents who competed to spoil her with handmade blankets and tiny rosaries. Isabel sat in the same front pew where Vincent had once displayed her like a trophy wife. But everything else had changed. She wore simple clothes that she'd chosen herself, held her daughter without calculating how the image would reflect on anyone else's reputation, and listened to Father Sullivan's homily with the engaged attention of someone whose faith had been tested and emerged stronger. Vincent's legal troubles had continued to mount throughout the spring. The criminal assault conviction had resulted in community service and probation. The civil lawsuits from former foundation partners would take years to resolve. His tech companies, now run by boards that had voted him out, were slowly rebuilding their reputations without their toxic founder. More significantly, Vincent's excommunication had created ripple effects throughout the Catholic philanthropic world. Other wealthy donors had quietly distanced themselves from charitable giving that prioritized recognition over impact, concerned that their own behavior might face similar scrutiny. "The accountability is spreading," Rebecca had observed during their weekly planning meeting for Catherine's house. "Rich men who used to think charity was insurance against consequences are actually examining their own behavior." Catherine's house itself had become a model program, featured in Vatican publications and Catholic University case studies. The shelter had housed 43 women and 31 children in its first 6 months of operation, with a success rate that made traditional domestic violence programs take notice. "We're different because we understand that pregnancy changes everything," Isabel explained to audiences at the speaking engagements that now filled her calendar. "A woman with an infant can't disappear into a generic shelter system. She needs specialized support that addresses her unique vulnerabilities." The speaking circuit had been unexpected but fulfilling. Catholic universities, diocesan conferences, and Vatican symposiums all wanted to hear from someone who had experienced domestic violence firsthand and could articulate how the Church could better respond to the crisis. Today's Mass was special because Cardinal Morrison was celebrating his 70th birthday with the parish community that had supported him through one of the most challenging periods of his ecclesiastical career. His decisive action in the Thornton case had been praised by Pope Francis himself and had established new protocols for how the church would handle domestic violence cases involving wealthy donors. "Uncle Thomas looks happy," Isabel observed to Margaret Morrison as they watched the Cardinal process down the center aisle. "He looks vindicated," Margaret replied with satisfaction. 40 years of fighting corruption in various forms, and this case proved that the church really can choose principles over money when it matters. The Mass proceeded with the familiar rhythms that had comforted Isabel through childhood, marriage, crisis, and recovery. But when Cardinal Morrison delivered his homily, his words carried personal meaning that resonated through every pew. "Today I want to speak about the difference between charity and justice," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral's acoustics. "Charity writes checks. Justice changes systems. Charity feels good about helping people. Justice asks why people need help in the first place." Catherine chose that moment to make her own contribution to the homily, offering a perfectly timed babble that made the congregation chuckle with affection. "It seems Catherine has her own thoughts about justice." Cardinal Morrison smiled, his eyes finding his great niece with unmistakable love. "Which is appropriate, because she represents the next generation children who will grow up in a church that refuses to tolerate violence against the vulnerable, regardless of how much money is offered to look the other way." After Mass, the birthday reception in the fellowship hall buzzed with conversations about the changes that had swept through Catholic social services since the Thornton case. Donors were asking more questions about how their money was used. Charities were implementing better oversight procedures. Victims were finding more support when they sought help. "The system is actually changing," Dr. Elena Vasquez observed, joining Isabel near the dessert table where Catherine was attracting admiration from every passing parishioner. 6 months ago, wealthy abusers could count on charitable giving to protect them from consequences. Now that protection is gone, Matform. Father Sullivan approached with the satisfied expression of a priest whose parish had weathered crisis and emerged stronger. "Isabel, I wanted you to know 3 more parishes have contacted us about implementing Catherine's House programs in their communities. The Archdiocese of New York approved funding for a pilot program last week. The expansion was gratifying but also overwhelming. Each new program meant more women and children who would have access to specialized support. But it also meant more responsibility for Isabel as the recognized expert in Catholic domestic violence prevention." "Are you ready for the Vatican Conference next month?" Father Sullivan asked. The Holy See's International Symposium on Family Violence would bring together church leaders from 6 continents to develop new policies and programs. Isabel's keynote address would be the first time a domestic violence survivor had spoken to Vatican officials about the intersection of wealth, power, and abuse within Catholic communities. "I'm nervous," Isabel admitted, adjusting Catherine against her shoulder as the baby dozed peacefully amid the reception noise. "Speaking to parish groups is one thing. Addressing cardinals and bishops about church policy is intimidating." "You'll be speaking truth to power," Cardinal Morrison said, appearing beside them with the quiet pride of someone whose protective instincts had finally found perfect expression. "Something you've become quite good at." Rebecca joined their small circle, her laptop bag indicating she'd been working on Catherine's house business even during the birthday celebration. "Vincent sent a letter," she announced without preamble. The statement dropped into their conversation like a stone into still water. Vincent had maintained complete silence since the restraining order was finalized, communicating only through lawyers about financial settlements and custody arrangements. "What kind of letter?" Dr. Vasquez asked with professional interest. Isabel felt her chest tighten with familiar anxiety before Catherine's warm weight against her shoulder reminded her that she was no longer the vulnerable woman who had feared Vincent's communications. She was surrounded by people who would protect her, holding a daughter who represented everything good about her future. "Read it," she said firmly. Rebecca pulled out her phone and found the forwarded message. "He says the court ordered him to write this as part of his community service requirements at the Catholic Worker House." The requirement made sense. Accountability letters to victims were standard components of domestic violence intervention programs, though most abusers approached them as box-checking exercises rather than genuine reflection. Rebecca began reading, "Isabel, I have been ordered by the court to write this letter as part of my community service at the Catholic Worker House. I help serve meals to homeless women now. many of them pregnant or with small children. Yesterday, a teenage girl came in with bruises that looked exactly like the ones I gave you. The letter continued with details that suggested Vincent's community service was providing education he'd never received, despite years of writing checks to homeless shelters. Seeing her face made me finally understand what I was. Rebecca read, I don't ask for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I just want you to know that Catherine's house saved that girl's life last night. The foundation you built from the ruins of mine is doing the work I only pretended to do. Isabel listened with the detached attention of someone observing from a distance. Vincent's recognition of his behavior was probably genuine. Prison sentences and court-ordered therapy had a way of forcing self-awareness on resistant personalities. Our daughter will grow up knowing her mother is a hero, the letter concluded. That's more than I ever gave her. The reception noise continued around them, but their small circle had grown quiet as they processed Vincent's unexpected communication. How do you feel about it, Doctor? Vasquez asked gently. Isabel considered the question while watching Cardinal Morrison accept birthday congratulations from parishioners who had supported him through one of the most challenging cases of his career. Around them, conversations buzzed with updates about charitable programs, children's achievements, community concerns, the ordinary business of people building lives together. Relieved, she said finally. He finally understands what he was. That's important for Catherine, even if it doesn't change anything for me. The letter would be filed away with other legal documents related to their divorce. Vincent's recognition of his behavior was progress, but it didn't erase 3 years of abuse or the terror Isabel had lived with daily. His epiphany was his own journey. Her healing was separate and already well underway. Are you going to respond? Rebecca asked. No, Isabel said without hesitation. Some bridges, once burned, are meant to stay that way. Catherine stirred against her shoulder, opening dark eyes that were already showing signs of the Morrison family intelligence. In a few years, she would ask questions about her father, about why she lived with her mother's family, about the complicated history that had shaped her early life. When that time came, Isabel would tell her daughter the truth, that love never required silence about violence, that institutions could choose justice over money, that women's voices mattered even when powerful men tried to silence them. Cardinal Morrison found her in the garden behind the rectory later that evening, where she often walked with Catherine when sleep proved elusive. Chicago's skyline glittered in the distance, and the baby dozed contentedly in her stroller. Any regrets? He asked gently, the question that had become their evening ritual. Isabel looked at her sleeping daughter, then at the city lights where Catherine's house was helping its newest residents build safe lives. She thought about the Vatican conference where she would challenge church leaders to examine their own complicity in protecting wealthy abusers. She considered the speaking engagements, the policy work, the foundation board meetings that filled her days with purpose she'd forgotten was possible. Only that it took so long to find my voice, she said, but Catherine will grow up knowing hers matters from day one. The cathedral bells chimed the hour across the city, their sound carrying over buildings where Catherine's house offered sanctuary, where former Thornton Foundation partners had restructured their programs around justice rather than charity, where other women might be finding the courage to speak their own truths. Vincent Thornton's empire had crumbled completely, but from its ruins had grown something infinitely more valuable, proof that no amount of money could purchase immunity from consequences, that women's voices could not be permanently silenced, and that institutions committed to protecting the vulnerable would always ultimately triumph over individuals dedicated to exploiting them. The perfect Catholic couple was dead, but the real Isabel Morrison, surrounded by her daughter and her chosen family, had finally been fully reborn, in boardrooms and Vatican offices, in shelter kitchens and therapy sessions, in courtrooms and cathedral pulpits. The ripple effects of one woman's courage continued spreading. The church had chosen justice over money, and that choice would echo through generations of women who would grow up knowing that their voices mattered, their safety was sacred, and their truth could not be bought or silenced. And somewhere in Chicago, a baby girl slept peacefully, dreaming perhaps of a world where such courage would no longer be necessary, but where it would always be celebrated when it emerged.